Hey everyone, Vitaliy here with 64 Audio, and I'm backstage at the J. Coder and Friends Christmas Comes Alive concert. Let's go see what we got. All right, so I wanted to show a little bit of the gear that is being used for mixing in-ears here. Of course, the central piece is the Allen & Heath D-Live console. This board has like a bazillion inputs, and most importantly, it has enough auxes and enough reverb sends and things like that to really mix monitors properly for, I think we have about a 12-piece band going on. In order for the musicians to get their mix, we obviously use wireless systems. Here we're using a mix of Shure and Sennheiser wireless systems, and also using custom in-ear monitors. I'm obviously using 64s. Some of the people are on different generic buds and things like that because they don't have customs. So I chose our A3E as kind of a baseline. You know, it's not the most expensive, obviously, but I felt like that the A3E is kind of the middle of the road for a lot of different earpieces, and so most musicians are pretty happy with the mix, so I think they do a great job of that. Got a lot of like meat. So usually a concert starts off with what's called a line check. And a line check is basically a way to check that all the signals are coming in to the right channels in the board. And usually it's where you set your gain. A gain is pretty important because if you set your gain too low, you're not going to have enough volume to work with. If you set your gain too high, you're going to run into clipping issues and distortion. So as we go through each channel, we're basically setting the gain. If I have the time, also going through and adjusting EQ and maybe even compression a little bit. So again, you're not building a full mix, you're just going through making sure that you have the right levels set on your signals coming in. And it's kind of a left brain, right brain thing. You got to get that out of the way so that later you can just focus on bringing all the sounds together for a musical sounding mix. So once the gains are set, usually what we'll do is we will have the rhythm section play so that we can kind of bring some basics into the mix. And the rhythm section is really the foundation of a good mix. The reason why we get those in first is because we want to kind of make lay the bedrock or the foundation, so to speak, for placing vocals and other instruments that are usually higher up in frequencies that aren't as heavy in the mix. And so once you get the rhythm section to sit well and to, be loud enough and be at the right blend, it's a lot easier to blend vocals and things like that on top of it. And so we'll go through and I'll just ask the guys to kind of jam on a tune or just do some kind of improv thing, and that's where I'm setting the levels between the drums, bass, guitars, and keyboards. So after we've got the rhythm section sit where I like it and it feels good, it's nice and full, the next thing that usually we bring in are instruments, like I mentioned, that are kind of solo instruments, usually vocals at that point will get brought in. And the thing with vocals is you don't want to wear out the vocalist by having them sing too much. With the vocals, because we didn't essentially line check them before, usually the line check and the mix happens together. It's not that difficult because you're only dealing with one or two vocalists, so it's pretty easy to set gains, and then you essentially place them in the mix according to, whether it's a background vocal or a lead vocal. But the most important thing about vocals is usually a little bit of compression, and you need to bring in the ambience processors, or effects as people call them. The biggest reason for this is because vocals, when dry, don't really sit well in the mix in-ears. It's kind of an unnatural feeling. And so usually when I start bringing vocals in, the very first thing that I try to make sure that I get in there is the reverb. You don't want to have too much reverb, because that's kind of make it washy and make it a little bit unnatural for the singer. Reverb just enough to inspire, to get a little tail going on the vocal, make them feel they're like in a big room. That usually really inspires vocalists, and they're pretty happy with that, and they usually walk away with a smile on their face. The other thing I wanted to mention about, especially vocalists, but essentially any musician on stage, is to try to make them wear both ears at the same time. A lot of times I see, you know, that one earphone dangling out. There's two things that they're missing out on. They're missing out on the hearing protection part of in-ear monitors, especially if they're standing next to a loud instrument like drums and loud guitar amps. And the other thing is they're not really getting the fullness of the mix. A mono mix with one ear can never sound as good as a full stereo mix. It just doesn't compare. You're not going to feel as comfortable, even though a lot of people take the one ear out, which is usually a sign of a bad mix going on. So essentially, yeah, getting the vocals placed in the mix kind of rounds out the mix usually, and then it's about monitoring what's going on with musicians. I will say that, you know, you'll never have a set it and forget it mix. For example, vocalists will push harder, they'll go lighter. You know, same thing goes for instrumentalists. Sometimes the drummer will, on a tune that's a lot more relaxed, will back off, and all of a sudden it doesn't sound the way that you want it to, because he's now has changed dynamics. So you do have to constantly be, or actively be, mixing monitors, just like a front of house guy does. There is no such thing as a static mix. So one of the things that I learned over the years is, as you're building mixes, not to spend too much time EQing or compressing or, you know, gating your sounds. Usually that wears the musicians out, and they get irritated a little bit, you know, that things aren't happening as quickly as they want, because they're not engineers. They just want a mix to be there, because as they're wearing in-ears, you know, you're kind of starting from a blank canvas. So the thing that I've learned is to kind of move quickly, get the mix going, you know, to the best of your ability, and then basically go back and finesse things and tune things up and clean things up and compress and maybe, or EQ it the way that you really want. That's one of the things that kind of took me a little bit to wrap my head around in order for the sound check to go smoother. And I guarantee you, if you do that, you will have happier musicians walking off the stage, because you give them a mix to work with first, and then you go back and make it better, and they notice that. The other thing that really helps you understand how your mix sounds on stage is to actually, you know, solo up the mix, let's say, of a lead singer, and walk out onto the stage and actually stand there, because you'd be surprised how sound will change, because, you know, your in-ears don't block out sound completely, and so especially the low frequency energy still kind of makes it through. It's interesting sometimes when a musician will not be happy with their mix, and you can't figure out what's wrong with it until you go and stand in their spot and listen to their mix through your earphones, and then you figure out that, yeah, they're next to the drums or they're next to the guitar and things are really loud, just because you're in a different spot. So that's another way to really understand what's happening in their ears, is to go and kind of be in their shoes for a minute. Another thing that is usually challenging for mixing in-ears are condenser microphones on stage. In this setup, we have a Steinway 9-foot grand piano that, you know, sounds great, but it has a couple of condenser microphones picking up the sound of it. And one of the guys came to me and said, I feel like I have some kind of room mics on. And we figured out that piano mics were catching a lot of the room sound. Be aware that when you're working with condensers on stage, they tend to be your room mics. They tend to pick up a lot more than what they're pointed at. And there are ways to kind of fight that. There are ways you can strategically place instruments on stage to try to minimize that bleed. Just keep in mind that just because it's a piano mic or it's a choir mic doesn't mean that it doesn't actually become literally a room mic for you. And this actually happens with vocalists too, because their microphone is so loud in their mix, it will actually kind of act as a mono room mic as well, especially a condenser microphone, because it's sitting on top of everything else, and you know, drums and other loud instruments, because they're so much louder than the voice, they sometimes will make it into the vocal microphone, and you can't really EQ it out or get rid of it because it's part of the sound that's going into that mic. So also be aware of where your vocalists are at in relationship to your drummers and percussionists, and any loud instrument of that kind will bleed into the vocal mics and into most condenser mics that are on stage.